Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle journey through the pages of history. As you settle into your bed for a peaceful night's rest, I invite you to travel with me to a time long ago, an era of towering stone castles, armored knights, and powerful rulers who shaped the destiny of nations. Before we begin our tale, imagine yourself drifting back through the centuries, leaving behind the cares of the modern world. Let the soft rhythm of these words carry you backward through time, past the modern age, past the Industrial Revolution, past the age of exploration, all the way to the medieval period that stretched from roughly the 5th century to the 15th century. Now, let us paint the scene with careful brushstrokes. Picture a time in distant memory, when Europe was divided into countless kingdoms, each ruled by a monarch whose word carried the weight of law. The medieval period stretched across many centuries, a time of both grandeur and hardship, when the fate of entire populations rested in the hands of kings and queens who lived in a world vastly different from our own. The landscape was dotted with fortified castles perched on hilltops, their thick stone walls rising high against the sky. Below these imposing structures, villages of thatched-roof cottages clustered together, where common folk worked the land from sunrise to sunset. In this narrative, we shall explore the lives of these medieval rulers, examining how absolute authority shaped their behavior and choices. As we delve into these historical accounts, it is essential to understand the context of their world. In an age when monarchs were believed to be chosen by divine providence, rulers held supreme power over their subjects. They were viewed as almost godlike figures, appointed by heaven itself to govern as they deemed fit. This belief system, known as the divine right of kings, meant that challenging a monarch's authority was not merely a political act, but was considered a sin against the natural order established by the heavens themselves. The daily life of a medieval king began before dawn, when servants would enter the royal chamber to assist with the elaborate morning rituals. The king would be dressed in layers of fine clothing, each garment more luxurious than anything a common person might touch in their entire lifetime. Silk undergarments imported from distant eastern lands, woolen tunics dyed in rich colors that only royalty could afford, and finally outer robes trimmed with fur and embroidered with golden thread. The process of dressing alone could take an hour or more, with multiple attendants carefully arranging each piece of clothing to perfection. One of the most notable aspects of medieval rulership was the extraordinary wealth and luxury that surrounded the royal courts. Kings and queens inhabited a realm of unimaginable splendor, surrounded by the finest possessions that resources could provide. They dwelled in massive fortresses with grand reception halls, luxurious sleeping chambers, and meticulously tended gardens. The great halls of these castles were enormous spaces, their high ceilings supported by thick stone columns, their walls adorned with colorful tapestries depicting hunting scenes, battles, and religious imagery. Large fireplaces, tall enough for a man to stand inside, provided warmth during the cold winter months. Their fires tended constantly by servants, whose sole duty was to ensure the royal family remained comfortable. They wore garments crafted from the most costly fabrics, decorated with precious stones and elaborate needlework. A single royal outfit might require months of work by skilled seamstresses and tailors, with tiny stitches creating intricate patterns of flowers, vines, and heraldic symbols. Pearls, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds would be sewn directly onto the fabric, catching the light from hundreds of candles and creating a dazzling display whenever the monarch moved. The crowns themselves were masterworks of the goldsmith's art, heavy circlets of precious metal set with the largest and finest gemstones available, each one a symbol of royal power and divine favor. And they dined on the most sumptuous meals, enjoying a seemingly endless variety of delicacies from distant lands. The royal kitchens were vast operations, employing dozens of cooks, bakers, butchers, and scullery workers who labored from early morning until late at night to produce the elaborate meals expected at court. Spices that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron were used liberally in royal dishes, adding exotic flavors that advertised the king's wealth and international connections. These royal feasts were not merely displays of prosperity and influence. They also became settings for excessive indulgence. Medieval monarchs were well known for their fondness of food and drink, often consuming these pleasures to the point of overabundance. A typical royal feast might include 20 or 30 different dishes, each one more elaborate than the last. The meal would begin with appetizers of fruits, nuts, and small pastries. Then would come soups and stews, followed by multiple courses of fish prepared in various styles: baked, fried, poached in wine, or served cold in aspic. The main courses would feature various meats: whole roasted pigs with apples in their mouths, haunches of venison from the royal hunting forests, peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own colorful feathers for presentation, swans similarly prepared, and beef, mutton, and poultry in abundance. Each meat might be accompanied by rich sauces made with wine, honey, vinegar, and those precious imported spices. Between courses, entertainers would perform: musicians playing lutes and harps, jesters telling jokes and performing acrobatics, trained dogs doing tricks, or singers performing ballads about ancient heroes and legendary battles. They would consume enormous quantities of meat, bread, and confections, accompanied by copious amounts of wine and ale. Some rulers were known to consume up to 5,000 calories daily, a staggering amount that would exceed even the most vigorous modern appetite. The bread alone came in multiple varieties: fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour for the high table, darker breads for lesser nobles, and the coarsest brown bread for servants. Desserts would conclude the feast: elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like castles or ships, fruit tarts, custards flavored with rose water, honey cakes, marzipan-shaped and painted to look like miniature animals, and candied fruits preserved in thick syrup. The wine served at royal tables came from the finest vineyards, transported in carefully sealed barrels and stored in cool cellars beneath the castle. Red wines from France, sweet wines from Spain, and strong ales brewed in the castle's own brewery flowed freely throughout the feast. Noble guests would drink from silver or even golden goblets, while the king himself might use a jewel-encrusted chalice that required 2 hands to lift when filled. One particularly notable example of royal overconsumption was William of Normandy, the warrior king who invaded and conquered England in the year 1066. William was a formidable military leader and a skilled strategist, but he was also renowned for his love of feasting. As a young man, William had been lean and muscular, hardened by years of warfare and political struggle in his native Normandy. He could ride all day, fight in heavy armor, and command armies with the energy and endurance of a natural athlete in his later years. However, he became so corpulent that he could barely mount a horse, much less lead his armies into combat. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Year by year, feast after feast, William's waistline expanded. His armor had to be repeatedly modified, led out by royal blacksmiths who worked through the night to accommodate their king's growing girth. Eventually, even modified armor became uncomfortable, and William took to wearing loose robes instead of the military dress he had once favored. According to historical accounts, William's excessive weight gain resulted from particularly indulgent banquets during which he reportedly consumed entire roasted birds, whole loaves of bread, and multiple vessels of wine. One chronicler described a feast where William, already uncomfortably full, insisted on sampling every dish that arrived from the kitchen, unwilling to let his guests think he lacked the capacity to appreciate the cook's efforts. By the end of that evening, it was said, the king had to be helped to his chambers by 4 strong servants, barely able to walk under his own power. The weight became such a burden that William's enemies began to mock him. The King of France, upon hearing that William was bedridden with illness, joked that the English king must be pregnant and asked when he would give birth. When William heard of this insult, he flew into a rage and vowed revenge, but his weakened physical condition made such threats ring hollow. Where once he had been feared as a warrior king who personally led cavalry charges, he was now confined to a cart when traveling, unable to sit a horse for more than a few minutes without pain. But William was not the only medieval monarch to surrender to the temptations of gluttony. Many kings and queens were famous for their lavish feasts and extravagant dining customs. The sheer amount of food consumed at these royal banquets is difficult for modern minds to comprehend. While common people might eat 2 modest meals a day, consisting primarily of bread, porridge, and vegetables with only occasional meat, the royal court feasted multiple times daily on the finest foods available. In the 15th century, for example, the court of King Richard of York in England was celebrated for its opulent banquets, which featured such delicacies as roasted swan, peacock, and other exotic meats. The preparation of these birds was itself an elaborate affair. The swan would first be killed and plucked, then roasted slowly over a fire, basted repeatedly with butter and herbs. Once cooked, the bird would be carefully redressed in its own white feathers and presented at the high table, with its neck positioned elegantly upward, wings spread as if in flight, giving the illusion that a living swan was somehow served on a golden platter. Peacocks receive similar treatment, their iridescent tail feathers preserved and displayed in a fan behind the roasted bird. Sometimes the peacock would be presented with small candles in its beak, flames flickering to create an even more dramatic presentation. These elaborate displays served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the wealth required to obtain such rare birds, showcased the skill of the royal kitchen staff, and provided visual entertainment during the feast. Other unusual dishes might include porpoise, which was classified as fish rather than meat, and therefore could be eaten on days when the church forbade meat consumption. Whale meat occasionally appeared at coastal kingdoms' tables. Sturgeon was so prized that it was considered a royal fish, with laws stating that any sturgeon caught in English waters belonged to the king. Lampreys, eel-like fish considered a great delicacy, were often baked into pies. Indeed, one king reportedly died from eating too many lamprey pies, unable to stop himself despite warnings from his physicians. These feasts served as demonstrations of royal wealth and power, impressing guests with culinary magnificence. Foreign ambassadors who attended would return to their home countries with tales of the incredible abundance at the court, tales that would enhance the host king's reputation across Europe. To be known as a generous host who set a magnificent table was an important part of royal prestige, a way of showing that one's kingdom was prosperous and, while governed, that the excesses of the royal courts extended beyond food and drink alone. Medieval kings were also celebrated for their love of entertainment, and they would often arrange elaborate spectacles to amuse themselves and their courtiers. They would organize grand tournaments complete with jousting and other displays of martial skill. These tournaments were major events that could last several days, drawing knights from across the kingdom and even from foreign lands. The tournament grounds would be elaborately decorated with colorful banners and pennants, bearing the heraldic arms of participating knights. Wooden stands were constructed for noble spectators, covered with cloth awnings to provide shade. The king and queen would sit in a place of honor, often beneath a magnificent canopy embroidered with royal symbols. Ladies of the court would wear their finest gowns and sit in the stands, many holding colored ribbons or scarves to give as favors to their preferred champions. The jousting itself was both spectacular and dangerous. Knights in full armor would thunder toward each other on horseback, long wooden lances aimed at their opponent's shield or chest. The impact when lance met armor could be tremendous, sometimes knocking knights completely from their saddles to crash heavily onto the ground. Injuries were common, and deaths were not unknown, despite rules meant to minimize danger. The sound of the contest, hoofbeats pounding, armor clanking, wood splintering, and the crowd roaring, created an atmosphere of controlled chaos and excitement. Between jousting matches, other competitions might occur. Knights would demonstrate their skill with swords, competing in mock combats with blunted blades. Archery contests would test accuracy and power. Foot races, wrestling matches, and other athletic competitions allowed knights to prove their prowess in different arenas. Throughout all of this, heralds would announce each competitor. Minstrels would perform songs between events, and servants would circulate through the crowds offering wine and refreshments. They would present grandiose pageants and masquerades featuring elaborate costumes, music, and dance. These theatrical productions could be remarkably sophisticated, with complex plots drawn from classical mythology, Arthurian legend, or religious allegory. Actors, sometimes professional entertainers, sometimes nobles who enjoyed performing, would wear ornate costumes and speak, memorize lines, or improvise within established scenarios. One popular form of entertainment was the mask, where participants would dress in elaborate masks and costumes representing various characters, gods and goddesses, personifications of virtues and vices, exotic foreigners, or fantastical creatures. These masked figures would process into the Great Hall, sometimes accompanied by elaborate mobile stages pulled by servants or horses, depicting castles, ships, or mythical landscapes. Music would accompany the spectacle, with musicians hidden from view to create the illusion that the scenes themselves were producing the sounds. Dancing was another major element of court entertainment. Medieval dances ranged from stately, formal movements where partners barely touched, to livelier folk-inspired dances with jumping and spinning. The king and queen might lead the dancing, with all other dancers following their movements and changes of direction. Learning the proper steps and being able to dance gracefully was considered an essential skill for any noble, courtier, and they would engage in various leisure pursuits from hunting and falconry to chess and backgammon. Hunting was perhaps the most popular pastime for medieval kings, combining physical exercise, martial training, and the excitement of the chase. Royal hunting forests covered vast areas of land, carefully maintained and protected by forest laws that severely punished commoners who poached the king's deer. A kata, royal hunt, was an elaborate affair requiring extensive preparation. Huntsmen would scout the forest days in advance, identifying where deer, boar, or other game animals were most plentiful. On the day of the hunt, the king and his party would rise early, donning special hunting attire and mounting their finest horses. A pack of hunting dogs, sleek coursing hounds for chasing deer, or fierce mastiffs for pursuing boar, would accompany them, their handlers struggling to contain the animals' excitement. The hunt itself could last all day, with riders galloping through forests and across fields in pursuit of fleeing game. The dogs would chase the quarry, their barking echoing through the trees, while mounted nobles followed behind, jumping over fallen logs and streams in their headlong pursuit. When the prey was finally cornered or exhausted, the king himself would often deliver the final blow, using a spear or sword. The successful hunter would be praised and congratulated, and the slain animal would be butchered on the spot, with choice cuts reserved for the royal table. Falconry was considered an even more refined pursuit, requiring patience, skill, and a deep understanding of birds of prey. Each noble would have their own hawk or falcon, trained over months or years to hunt in cooperation with its human partner. The birds were kept hooded when not hunting, fed carefully controlled diets, and exercised regularly to maintain their fitness. Taking a falcon hunting was a more contemplative activity than the mad dash of a deer hunt. The falconer would walk through fields or along riverbanks, watching the sky and ground for game birds such as pheasants or ducks, then releasing their raptor to strike from above. For quieter moments, board games provided entertainment. Chess was highly popular among the nobility, seen as good training for military strategy. The pieces had the same basic movements as in modern chess, though some rules differed. Games could last hours, with players studying the board intently, considering moves and countermoves. Backgammon was another favorite, combining strategy with the chance element of dice rolls. Card games were also played, though playing cards were expensive and considered luxury items. Of course, not all entertainment in the medieval court was innocent. Kings and queens were known to indulge in more questionable pastimes. Many medieval monarchs had reputations for numerous romantic entanglements, engaging in relationships outside marriage and fathering children beyond their legitimate heirs with considerable frequency. This behavior was often overlooked or even tacitly accepted, particularly for male monarchs, though it could create considerable political complications. One such king was Henry of England, who ruled from the year 1100 to 1135. Despite his marriage to Matilda of Scotland, a union arranged for political advantage, Henry was known for his numerous companions and unofficial offspring. According to various accounts, he fathered as many as 20 or 30 children outside of wedlock, many of whom went on to hold significant positions in church and government. Some became bishops or abbots, others married into noble families or received lands and titles from their royal father. These illegitimate children represented both a source of pride and a potential political problem for Henry. On one hand, they demonstrated his virility and masculine power, important qualities for a medieval king to display. On the other hand, they could create succession disputes or rival claims to power if not carefully managed. Henry handled this by acknowledging his children and providing for them, but always making clear the distinction between legitimate heirs and those born outside marriage. His legitimate son would inherit the throne, while his other children would support the crown from various positions throughout the kingdom. Henry's behavior was so widely known that historians noted his particularly active personal life. Chroniclers would sometimes mention his various relationships in their historical accounts, though usually in indirect or euphemistic language. The church officially disapproved of such conduct, but rarely took action against powerful kings. Some clerics would preach sermons about the importance of marital fidelity, carefully avoiding naming any particular king, while everyone in the congregation understood exactly whom they meant. But while the indulgence and excess of the medieval court may seem harmless in retrospect, it often had serious consequences for those affected. Kings and queens who indulged too heavily in food, drink, and other pleasures frequently suffered from various health problems, from weight-related issues to liver ailments and even premature death. Medieval medicine had little understanding of how diet affected health, though physicians recognized that excessive eating and drinking could cause problems. Royal doctors would prescribe various treatments for ailments caused by overindulgence, bloodletting to remove corrupt humors from the body, purgatives to cleanse the digestive system, special diets of bland foods, or periods of fasting to give the body time to recover. None of these treatments were particularly effective, and some may have made matters worse. A king suffering from gout caused by a diet rich in meat and wine might be bled with leeches or have scarifications made in his skin, weakening him further without addressing the root cause of his condition. Their subjects often bore the burden of their excesses as resources were diverted from important matters of state to fund the lavish lifestyles of the nobility. The food consumed at a single royal feast might represent the annual grain harvest of several farming villages. The wine served in one evening's banquet might cost more than a craftsman could earn in years of labor. While the court feasted on swan and peacock, common people might struggle to afford even coarse bread and thin soup. Taxes were often raised to support royal extravagance. Special levies might be imposed to pay for a particularly lavish tournament or to construct a new wing of the royal palace. Farmers already working at the edge of subsistence would be required to surrender an even larger portion of their harvest to feed the royal household and court. Craftsmen would be conscripted to work on royal projects, taken away from their own businesses and families. The burden fell heaviest on those least able to bear it. While those who benefited most, the king and his noble courtiers, remained insulated from the hardship their lifestyle imposed on others. The darker aspects of medieval kingship extended beyond mere overindulgence. Many monarchs of the time were known for harsh treatment of those who opposed them. In a world where the monarch's word was absolute law, even minor offenses could result in severe consequences. The justice system of medieval times was very different from modern notions of fair trials and proportional punishment. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no protection against self-incrimination. A person accused of a crime against the crown might be arrested and imprisoned without trial, held in dark dungeons with little food or water until they confessed or died. Torture was routinely employed to extract confessions, with interrogators using a variety of implements designed to inflict maximum pain, the rack that slowly stretched a person's body until joints dislocated, thumb screws that crushed fingers, hot irons pressed against flesh, and countless other devices of torment. One particularly severe example of royal punishment was the practice of execution by the method of hanging, drawing, and quartering. This grim punishment, reserved for the most serious crimes against the crown, involved multiple stages of suffering designed to make a public example of the condemned. The prisoner would first be dragged through the streets tied to a wooden frame, subjected to the jeers and thrown objects of the crowd. Then they would be hanged until nearly dead, but cut down before actually dying. Finally, their body would be cut open and divided into sections, which would then be displayed in various public locations as a warning to others. This horrific practice was used by many medieval kings as a means to assert their authority and instill fear in their subjects. The public nature of these executions was intentional by making subjects witness the terrible fate of traitors. Kings hoped to discourage any thoughts of rebellion or disobedience. Crowds would gather to watch executions, some people bringing their children to learn the lesson of obedience to royal authority. Street vendors would sell food and drink to the spectators, turning the gruesome event into a kind of public festival, though one with a dark and disturbing purpose. One king who employed such methods was Edward of England, who ruled from 1272 to 1307. Edward was known for his stern approach to governance, particularly regarding territories that resisted his authority. He was a tall, imposing figure nicknamed Longshanks for his long legs, and he had a commanding presence that could intimidate even hardened warriors. His reign was marked by military campaigns to expand English control over Wales and Scotland, campaigns that often involved brutal suppression of resistance. Edward often used severe punishments to deal with his enemies and those who opposed his rule. He believed that showing mercy to rebels only encouraged further rebellion, and that only through harsh punishment could order be maintained. In one particularly harsh incident, Edward ordered severe consequences for a Welsh prince named Dafydd, who had led a rebellion against English authority. Dafydd had initially supported Edward, but later led a revolt, seeing the English king's increasing control over Wales as a threat to Welsh independence. According to contemporary records, Dafydd was brought before Edward, who sentenced him to the ultimate punishment. The sentence was carried out with all the ceremony and publicity Edward could arrange, designed to send a clear message to anyone else considering rebellion against English rule. The event was witnessed by thousands, and accounts of it spread throughout the kingdom, contributing to Edward's reputation as a stern and unforgiving ruler. But Edward was not the only medieval king to use such severe methods. Many monarchs of the time were known for their harsh governance and their willingness to use force to maintain their power. The medieval world was a violent place, where warfare was nearly constant and life was often difficult and short, even in peacetime. In such an environment, rulers felt they needed to project strength and decisiveness, lest their neighbors see weakness and attack. Some kings would order the questioning of prisoners to extract confessions or information. Torture was seen as a legitimate tool of justice, based on the belief that pain would compel even the most stubborn criminal to tell the truth. Various methods were employed, each with its own particular horror. The strappado involved hanging a person by their wrists tied behind their back, dislocating shoulders. Water torture forced water down a person's throat until they felt they were drowning. Branding with hot irons left permanent marks on convicted criminals, making them easily identifiable and forever marking them as lawbreakers. Other medieval rulers would use public displays of punishment to instill fear in their subjects. Stocks and pillories were common in every town square, where minor offenders would be locked with their head and hands trapped, exposed to public ridicule and pelting with rotten vegetables or worse. Whipping posts allowed for public floggings, with the number of lashes determined by the severity of the offense. These public punishments served both to punish the individual and to remind everyone watching of the consequences of breaking laws. One particularly stern king was John of England, who ruled from 1199 to 1216. John was known for his harsh treatment of those who opposed him, and his reign was marked by constant conflict with his nobles. He was a suspicious and paranoid man, always fearing that his barons were plotting against him, and given the political realities of the time, his fears were often justified. This combination of justified paranoia and near absolute power led John to commit acts that shocked even his contemporaries. In one incident, John ordered severe measures against a group who had been sent to him in good faith as part of a peace negotiation. Rather than treating them with the courtesy and respect that diplomatic customs required, John saw them as potential threats or simply as pawns he could sacrifice to make a point. The incident created outrage among those who valued the traditional rules of diplomatic conduct, but John seemed to care little for such conventions when they conflicted with what he perceived as his interests. John's severity was not limited to his enemies, however. He was also known for his harsh treatment of his own subjects, particularly those unable to pay the heavy levies he imposed. Medieval kings had multiple sources of revenue income from crown lands, customs duties on trade, fees charged for various royal services, and taxes imposed on their subjects. But these sources were often insufficient to cover the costs of warfare, court expenses, and other royal expenditures, leading kings like John to impose ever heavier burdens on their people. John's tax collectors were notorious for their ruthlessness in extracting payments from reluctant taxpayers. They would arrive at a town or village with armed escorts, demand payment, and threaten severe consequences for non-payment. Those who could not pay might have their property seized, their livestock taken, or even be imprisoned until family members could raise the necessary funds. The burden was particularly heavy on Jewish communities, who were subject to special taxes and could be threatened or imprisoned when the king needed ready money. Perhaps the most controversial example of John's severity was his treatment of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was the son of John's older brother, Geoffrey, and was seen by many as a potential heir to the English throne. According to the principle of primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son, some argued that Arthur, as the son of John's elder brother, had a better claim to the throne than John himself. This made Arthur a permanent threat to John's position, a rallying point for anyone dissatisfied with John's rule. To eliminate this challenge to his power, John had Arthur imprisoned when the young man was only 16 years old. Arthur disappeared from historical records shortly after his imprisonment, and while the exact details of his fate are unknown, most historians believe John ordered his death. Some accounts suggest Arthur died in his cell, others that he was quietly executed, and still others that John himself killed his nephew in a fit of rage. Regardless of the specific details, the disappearance of Arthur of Brittany stands as one of the darkest moments of John's troubled reign. The story of Arthur's fate is shrouded in mystery, but it stands as a sobering example of the lengths to which medieval kings would go to maintain their authority. In a world where power was everything and weakness could lead to deposition or death, rulers like John felt they could not afford mercy or sentimentality, even toward family members. The consequences of this ruthless approach to power were far-reaching. John's harsh rule eventually provoked his barons into open rebellion, leading to the signing of Magna Carta in 1215, one of the first documents to place limits on royal power. Of course, not all medieval kings were as severe as John or as harsh as Edward. Some monarchs were known for their more unusual behaviors, indulging in peculiar interests or habits that set them apart from their peers. These eccentricities might seem harmless or even amusing from our modern perspective, but they often had serious consequences for the kingdoms these rulers governed. One such king was Henry of England, who ruled from 1509 to 1547. Henry is perhaps best known for his complicated personal life, which included 6 marriages and a dramatic break with the Catholic Church when the Pope refused to annul his first marriage. But beyond his marital history, Henry was also known for his extravagant tastes and his love of fine things. He was a man of immense appetites for food, for entertainment, for luxury, and for having things exactly as he wanted them. As a young man, Henry had been considered quite handsome and athletic. He was tall, over 6 feet at a time, when the average man stood only about 5.5 feet tall. He had a muscular build, reddish gold hair, and blue eyes. He excelled at sports and physical contests, particularly enjoying jousting, tennis, and hunting. He could dance for hours at court celebrations, and was known to be an accomplished musician who composed songs and played several instruments. But Henry was also an enthusiastic collector of art and artifacts, and he spared no expense in adorning his palaces with luxurious furnishings and decorations. He owned more than 60 residences, though he moved between them frequently, and many were rarely used. Each palace had to be kept fully staffed and maintained at all times, ready for a possible royal visit. Hampton Court Palace alone had over 1,000 rooms, including dozens of guest chambers for visiting nobles and ambassadors. The walls of Henry's palaces were covered with expensive tapestries woven with gold and silver thread, depicting biblical scenes, classical stories, or hunting scenes. He owned hundreds of these tapestries, which would be transported from palace to palace as he moved, requiring dozens of carts and servants just to manage his textile collection. His chambers contained furniture inlaid with ivory and mother of pearl, mirrors framed in gilt, and carpets imported from Turkey and Persia. Henry's extravagance extended beyond material possessions. He was also known for his love of food and drink, often hosting lavish banquets that lasted for days. These feasts showcased Henry's wealth and power, featuring the most exotic and expensive delicacies from around the world. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court were enormous, with multiple rooms dedicated to different stages of food preparation, one for baking bread, another for roasting meat, yet another for preparing pastries and sweets, over 50 master cooks worked in Henry's kitchens, assisted by hundreds of kitchen servants, scullions, and support staff. On a normal day, the kitchens might prepare meals for 600 to 800 people, the royal household, courtiers, servants, and guards. On special occasions, when foreign dignitaries visited or important celebrations occurred, the number could swell to over 1,000 people needing to be fed. One particularly decadent dish often served at Henry's banquets was roasted swan, considered a great delicacy. The swan would be carefully prepared and presented to the king and his guests, who would enjoy it along with various other meats, sweets, and fine wines. But swan was just one of many exotic dishes that appeared on Henry's table. Crane, heron, bittern, and other large birds were served at important feasts. Porpoise and dolphin, classified as fish for religious purposes, could be eaten on fast days when meat was forbidden. Lamprey pie was one of Henry's favorite dishes. Subtleties, elaborate sculptures, made from sugar and marzipan, would be brought out between courses, depicting castles, ships, or mythological scenes. These weren't meant to be eaten immediately, but rather to impress guests with their artistry, before being broken apart and distributed. Each subtlety might take a team of confectioners several days to create, with intricate details painted using edible dyes. But Henry's love of food had consequences. As he grew older, he became increasingly overweight and suffered from various health problems. The transformation was gradual but dramatic. In his 20s and 30s, Henry remained active and physically fit, burning off the excess calories through constant activity. But a series of accidents changed everything. A bad fall from a horse left him with a leg wound that never properly healed, becoming an ulcerated sore that plagued him for the rest of his life. Unable to exercise as he once had, but continuing to eat with the same enthusiasm, Henry's weight increased dramatically. According to some accounts, his waist eventually measured 54 inches, and he had to be lifted by mechanical devices to mount his horse or climb stairs. Special chairs were built to accommodate his bulk, and doorways in his palaces had to be widened. His clothing required extraordinary amounts of fabric. One doublet needed 7 yards of velvet, an enormous amount for a single garment. The leg ulcers caused constant pain and occasionally became infected, filling the air around the king with an unpleasant odor despite the best efforts of his physicians. They would clean the wounds, apply various salves and poultices, and bandage the leg, but the ulcers would inevitably return. Henry's temper, never pleasant at the best of times, became even more volatile when he was in pain. Courtiers learned to gauge the king's mood by observing how heavily he was limping or how often he winced. Henry suffered from other ailments as well. Gout made his joints ache, particularly his feet and hands. Headaches troubled him. He had difficulty sleeping. His breathing became labored, and he would wheeze and pant after even minor exertion. Some modern medical historians have speculated that Henry may have suffered from type 2 diabetes, given his symptoms of excessive weight, slow-healing wounds, and mood changes. Though of course this condition was unknown in the 16th century, despite his physical decline. However, Henry remained a formidable figure until the end of his reign. Though his body was failing, his mind remained sharp and his will remained strong. He continued to govern his kingdom, making decisions about foreign policy, religious reform, and domestic matters. He continued to order the execution of those who displeased him, advisors who gave bad counsel, wives who allegedly betrayed him, religious leaders who opposed his break with Rome, even in his final years. When he could barely walk and had to be carried in a special chair, no one dared oppose him openly. Henry's court remained a dangerous place to the very end. Courtiers competed for his favor while trying not to make enemies of other powerful individuals. Everyone spoke carefully in the king's presence, knowing that an unguarded word might be interpreted as treason. Those closest to the king were often in the most danger, Henry's rage could flare up suddenly, and someone who was a trusted advisor in the morning might find themselves in the Tower of London by evening, awaiting trial for crimes they didn't commit. But Henry was not the only medieval monarch to indulge in peculiar habits. Many kings of the time were known for eccentricities ranging from mildly amusing to downright strange. These unusual behaviors sometimes reflected underlying mental health issues. Other times they were simply the result of being raised from birth to believe that one was special and different from ordinary people, literally chosen by God to rule. One such king was Charles of France, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. Charles was known for episodes of mental distress that caused him to engage in unusual behaviors that frightened his courtiers and created serious problems for the governance of France. According to some accounts, Charles would often forget his own identity and would wander through his palaces, not recognizing his wife, his children, or his close advisors. He would wander the long corridors of the royal palace, lost and confused, convinced he was made of fragile glass that might shatter at any moment. This particular delusion became Charles's most famous symptom. He would refuse to allow anyone to come near him, fearing that even the gentlest touch might cause him to break into 1,000 pieces. His servants had to devise special arrangements to care for him during these episodes. They sewed iron rods into his clothing to provide reinforcement, hoping this might give him some sense of security. They padded the walls of his chambers and removed all hard furniture that he might accidentally bump into. During these episodes, Charles would stand perfectly still for hours, afraid to move lest he shatter himself. He would refuse to sit down, convinced that the pressure of sitting might crack his supposedly glassing body. Sometimes he would allow servants to wrap him in blankets, which seemed to provide some comfort, as if the layers of fabric would somehow protect his imagined fragile form. Other times, he would fly into panic if anyone approached, screaming warnings to stay away. The delusion would persist for weeks or sometimes months before gradually fading, allowing Charles to return to something resembling normal functioning. But then, without warning, it would return, plunging the king back into his strange conviction of being made of glass. Between these episodes, Charles could govern reasonably well, though he was always a somewhat tentative and uncertain ruler, as if part of him knew that another episode might strike at any moment. During these periods of mental distress, Charles would become agitated and unpredictable, causing concern among those around him. Once, during a particularly severe episode, he failed to recognize his own wife for 5 months, insisting that she was an impostor sent to deceive him. He became convinced that enemies were trying to poison his food, and would only eat meals prepared by one particular kitchen servant whom he trusted. He developed elaborate rituals that had to be followed exactly, and would become extremely upset if anything disrupted these patterns. On another occasion, Charles became fixated on the idea that his name was George, not Charles, and insisted that everyone address him by this name. Courtiers humored him, calling him King George when speaking with him directly, while continuing to refer to him as King Charles in official documents and when speaking among themselves. The episode lasted several weeks before Charles suddenly announced one morning that his name was, of course, Charles. And what had everyone been thinking calling him George? Despite his mental challenges, Charles remained on the throne for more than 4 decades, thanks largely to the efforts of his advisors who worked to maintain stability. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, essentially ran the kingdom during his worst episodes, making decisions in his name and managing the complex political situation. Various nobles and royal relatives also stepped in at different times, sometimes competing with each other for the right to govern in the king's name. But his reign was marked by constant difficulty as rival factions within the court sought to take advantage of the king's condition. When Charles was in one of his lucid periods, different advisors would rush to gain his ear, trying to get him to make decisions or issue orders that would benefit their faction. When he was in the grip of his delusions, these same factions would argue about who had the right to govern in his place. The result was a French court riven with intrigue and factional conflict, with the king himself a kind of prize to be controlled rather than a ruler in his own right. The situation was made worse by the ongoing 100 Years' War with England. Military decisions needed to be made quickly, but often had to wait until Charles was having a good day and could be consulted. Sometimes, generals would simply go ahead and act on their own authority, claiming afterward that they had received royal permission. The chaos contributed to French defeats and loss of territory during this period. Another medieval monarch known for mental instability was Henry of England, who ruled during two separate periods in the 15th century. Like Charles, Henry suffered from episodes that rendered him unable to govern effectively, and his reign was marked by constant political upheaval. According to contemporary accounts, Henry's difficulties began to manifest in the early years of his reign. He had been crowned as an infant, just 9 months old, when his father died, and spent his childhood as a figurehead while others governed in his name. He would often become unresponsive, staring blankly for hours, seemingly unaware of his surroundings or the people around him. During these catatonic episodes, he would not speak, would not eat unless food was placed directly in his mouth, and showed no reaction to events happening around him. Courtiers could pass their hands in front of his face without eliciting any response. He was like a living statue, breathing but otherwise motionless at other times. He would become agitated, though even his agitation seemed somehow distant and disconnected from reality. He would pace his chambers for hours, muttering to himself in a low voice that others could not quite make out. Sometimes he would laugh inappropriately at nothing in particular, or suddenly weep without apparent cause. His moods would shift rapidly and unpredictably, making it difficult for those around him to know how to respond. As Henry's condition deteriorated, his advisors became increasingly worried about stability. In 1453, Henry suffered a complete breakdown and became entirely unresponsive for more than a year. He was moved from room to room like a piece of furniture, positioned in a chair where he would sit unmoving until servants repositioned him. He had to be fed, dressed, and cared for like an infant. During this time, England effectively had no functioning king. This created a constitutional crisis. Who had the right to govern when the king could not? Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, claimed the right to rule in her husband's name. But many English nobles distrusted her. She was French at a time when England and France were enemies, and they suspected she would make decisions favoring French interests. The Duke of York, who was related to the royal family and had his own claim to the throne, also sought to take control, arguing that Henry's incapacity meant the crown should pass to someone capable of ruling. Eventually, Henry was deposed and imprisoned, where he would remain for several years. The conditions of his imprisonment were not particularly harsh by medieval standards. He was kept in the Tower of London, but given comfortable quarters and allowed servants to attend him. But he was no longer king. During his imprisonment, his mental condition seems to have improved somewhat, perhaps because he was freed from the burden of trying to rule despite his incapacity. Henry briefly regained his throne in 1470 when political circumstances shifted and his supporters were temporarily in power. But his second reign lasted less than a year before he was again removed. This time, his enemies were taking no chances on him, making another comeback. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry died in the Tower of London under mysterious circumstances. The official announcement said he died of melancholy, essentially that he died of sadness and despair, but most historians believe he was quietly eliminated to prevent him from being used as a figurehead by any future rebellions. The tale of Henry serves as a reminder of the immense pressure that medieval kingship could impose. In an age when a monarch's every move was scrutinized and rivals constantly plotted, even the most stable minds could be tested. For someone already struggling with mental health issues, the demands of kingship could be completely overwhelming. The tragedy is that Henry seems to have been, by nature, a gentle and pious person who would probably have been much happier as a monk or scholar than as a king. But the accident of his birth made him a king whether he was suited for it or not. Of course, not all medieval kings face such challenges. Some monarchs, particularly those who ascended at a young age, faced different obstacles altogether. These young kings, thrust into positions of immense responsibility before they were truly ready, often struggled to navigate the complex world of medieval politics. They had to learn on the job, so to speak, making mistakes that could have serious consequences while surrounded by adults who wanted to manipulate them for their own advantage. One such king was Edward of England, who became king at 14 after events surrounding his father. His father had been forced to abdicate, and there were many nobles who had supported the old king and resented the new one. Despite his youth, Edward proved to be remarkably capable and effective as a ruler, though it took him several years to fully establish his own authority and emerge from the shadow of those who had put him on the throne. Edward led England to military victories and expanded the kingdom's power and influence. But Edward's reign was not without challenges. As a young king, he was often influenced by advisors who sought to guide him or manipulate him, depending on one's perspective. The first few years of his reign saw intense competition among various noble factions, each trying to control the young king and govern in his name. Some of these advisors genuinely wanted to help Edward learn to rule effectively. Others saw him as a puppet they could control for their own benefit. Edward also faced constant pressure regarding marriage and producing heirs, as stability depended on smooth succession. Medieval politics was deeply concerned with lineage and inheritance. A king without a clear heir created uncertainty, and uncertainty could lead to civil war as various nobles put forward their own candidates for the throne. From the moment he became king, Edward's advisors were discussing potential marriage alliances, evaluating princesses from various kingdoms as possible brides, who would bring political advantages along with the promise of future princes. Despite these challenges, Edward managed to navigate the difficult waters of medieval politics and emerge as one of the successful rulers of his time. He proved to have a talent for warfare, personally leading armies and winning victories that enhanced his prestige. He was also politically shrewd, learning to play different factions against each other and gradually concentrating power in his own hands rather than remaining dependent on any single advisor or group of nobles. He expanded England's territories through military action, strengthening the economy through trade agreements, and laying groundwork for governmental development. He reformed the royal finances, establishing more efficient systems for collecting taxes and managing crown revenues. He supported the wool trade, which was England's major export industry, by negotiating favorable terms with foreign merchants and protecting English wool producers from excessive taxation. Edward's success was not solely due to his own abilities. He was fortunate to have the support of loyal advisors who helped him navigate complex politics. One of the most important was Edward's mother, Isabella of France, who played a key role in his early reign. Isabella was an intelligent and ambitious woman who had helped orchestrate the events that brought her son to the throne, overthrowing her own husband in the process. As Edward's regent during his minority, Isabella wielded significant influence, and she used her position to advance her interests and those of her close associates. She was instrumental in negotiating treaties that secured England's position and protected the young king from external threats. her political acumen, and international connections. She was, after all, a French princess by birth, proved valuable in the early years of Edward's reign. However, Isabella's influence was not without drawbacks. Her close relationship with a noble named Roger Mortimer led to rumors and political complications. Mortimer effectively ruled England through his control over Isabella and her influence over the young king. He used his position to enrich himself and his family, granting himself lands and titles, arranging advantageous marriages for his children, and eliminating rivals. Many English nobles resented Mortimer's power and the way he seemed to treat the kingdom as his personal property. Eventually, when Edward was 17, he decided he had been under others' control long enough. In a bold move, he had Mortimer arrested and executed for treason. It was a dramatic assertion of royal authority. The young king was declaring that he, not his mother's favorite, would rule England. Isabella was retired from political life, but otherwise left alone, living comfortably on her estates for many more years. The incident marked Edward's true beginning as an independent ruler. Despite this early drama, Edward continued to rely on trusted advisors throughout his reign. He forged relationships with other European monarchs and used these alliances to advance England's interests. He was skilled at diplomacy as well as warfare, knowing when to negotiate and when to fight. His long reign saw England become one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, with territorial holdings in France and strong economic connections across the continent. While Edward's reign was marked by many achievements, it was also characterized by a concerning trend common among medieval monarchs: the emphasis on bloodlines and purity of royal descent. In the medieval world, the concept of royal blood was seen as a powerful and almost magical force that could confer legitimacy on those who possessed it. This belief led to practices that would have unfortunate consequences for future generations. As we drift deeper into this historical narrative, let us turn our attention to the curious phenomenon of commoners who briefly became rulers through remarkable circumstances. These extraordinary stories may seem like fairy tales, but they occasionally occurred in the unpredictable world of medieval politics. They remind us that even in a rigidly hierarchical society, sometimes the impossible could happen, though usually not for very long and rarely with a happy ending. Take the saga of Hans the Shepherd, for example. Hans was a humble shepherd from a German village near Niklashausen, who gained followers after experiencing what he claimed were religious visions. In an age when religious experience was taken very seriously, Hans's visions attracted attention. He began preaching in the year 1476, standing in village squares and along roadsides, speaking to anyone who would listen about the messages he claimed to have received directly from the Virgin Mary. His message was revolutionary for the time. He spoke against corruption in the church, criticizing bishops and priests who lived in luxury while their flocks struggled in poverty. He called for social reform, suggesting that the common people deserve better treatment from their lords, and that the extreme inequality between rich and poor was not part of God's plan. He spoke of a coming time when all people would be equal, when there would be no nobles and no peasants, just one community of Christians living together in peace and brotherhood. Tens of thousands came to hear him speak, traveling from villages and towns across the region. They came in family groups, entire villages, sometimes emptying out as people made pilgrimages to wherever Hans was preaching. They brought their sick, hoping Hans's holiness might cure them. They brought offerings of food and money, supporting Hans and allowing him to preach full-time rather than tending sheep. The crowds grew so large that local authorities became alarmed. Assemblies of thousands of peasants could easily turn into riots or rebellions. At the height of his popularity, Hans began to make even bolder claims. He declared himself a chosen leader, someone selected by divine will to guide the common people to a better life. He suggested that the current social order, with its nobles and kings, was not ordained by God as the church claimed, but was instead a human corruption of God's true intention. He began living more comfortably, accepting donations from his followers and wearing better clothes than a shepherd could normally afford, but his rise was short-lived. The authorities, both church and secular, did not welcome an upstart commoner preaching revolutionary ideas and gathering large crowds. The Bishop of Wurzburg ordered Hans arrested in July of 1476. Hans's followers tried to protect him, surrounding him and refusing to let the soldiers through, but eventually the authorities brought enough armed men to overwhelm the crowd. Hans was taken to Wurzburg, where he was tried by an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy and inciting rebellion. The trial was brief. Hans was not allowed proper legal representation, and the outcome was predetermined. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. According to records, Hans recanted his teachings when faced with execution, admitting under pressure that his visions had not been real and that he had been mistaken in his preaching. Whether this recantation was genuine or extracted through threat and coercion, we cannot know. He was executed shortly after his trial, and his body was burned to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine to his followers. It was back to ordinary life for his followers. This would-be movement crushed before it could truly threaten the established order. The authorities made examples of some of Hans's most prominent followers as well, arresting and punishing them to discourage others from similar activities. Within a few months, the entire episode was over, though it was remembered and discussed for years afterward as an example of what happened when common folk got ideas above there. Station Hans was not the only commoner to have a brief encounter with power before meeting an unfortunate end. In 1358, a French peasant named Guillaume Caille crowned himself leader during a massive peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie. This rebellion erupted suddenly in the countryside north of Paris, driven by years of accumulated grievances against the noble class. The peasants had many reasons for anger. They bore the heaviest tax burdens, supporting both the church and the nobility with their labor. The 100 Years' War between France and England had devastated the countryside, with armies from both sides burning crops, stealing livestock, and destroying villages. The nobles, who were supposed to protect the common people in exchange for their support, had failed repeatedly in battle against the English, leading many peasants to question what value the nobility actually provided. The revolt began with isolated attacks on manor houses and noble estates. Groups of peasants would gather, arm themselves with farm tools and whatever weapons they could find, and attack the local lord's residence. They would burn the buildings, destroy records of debts and obligations, and sometimes kill nobles who failed to escape in time. The violence spread quickly, with success in one area inspiring similar actions elsewhere. Guillaume emerged as a leader during this chaos. He was apparently a man of some intelligence and charisma, able to organize the disparate rebel groups into something resembling an army. He gave speeches calling for the complete overthrow of the noble class, suggesting that peasants should rule themselves rather than being subject to lords who had proven their incompetence and corruption. At the height of his influence, Guillaume styled himself as a king of the common people. Though exactly what ceremony or process led to this self-coronation is unclear from historical records. Guillaume's reign lasted only a few weeks before the nobles organized a counterattack. The peasant army, largely untrained and poorly armed, was no match for professional knights and soldiers once the nobility gathered their forces. The revolt was crushed with extreme brutality at the Battle of Mello. Guillaume himself was captured shortly after the battle. The nobles, furious at the attacks on their estates and eager to make an example that would prevent future rebellions, subjected Guillaume to public torture before executing him. His followers were hunted down and killed by the hundreds, and the Jacquerie ended as suddenly as it had begun. Over in England, One commoner took an even bolder step in his quest for royal status. Lambert Simnel managed to convince a group of nobles that he was actually a prince, the rightful heir to the throne, in the year 1487. The political situation in England at that time was complex, with the Tudor dynasty newly established after years of civil war, and many nobles uncertain about the legitimacy of the current king. Henry VI. Lambert himself was just a boy, perhaps 10 years old, the son of a tradesman. But he had been trained by a priest named Richard Simmons, who taught him how to behave like a prince, how to walk, how to speak, how to carry himself with royal dignity. Simmons had his own reasons for this scheme, hoping to use the false prince to advance his own position and perhaps overthrow the Tudor king, with backing from some nobles who opposed Henry VII, and with support from Ireland, where many resented English rule. Lambert was actually crowned king in Dublin. The ceremony was performed with full royal ritual, with Lambert wearing a crown and receiving the homage of Irish nobles. For a brief moment, the son of a tradesman was, at least in Ireland, a king. But Lambert's aspirations came crashing down when his supporters invaded England and were defeated by King Henry's forces at the Battle of Stoke Field. This could have been the end of Lambert's story. Most people who claimed to be rightful kings and challenged the actual king with armed rebellion were executed swiftly and publicly. But in a curious twist that speaks to Henry VII's political shrewdness, the actual king took a different approach. Henry recognized that Lambert himself was just a boy who had been used by others. Rather than making him a martyr through execution, Henry exposed the deception publicly, forcing Lambert to admit he was just a commoner and not a prince at all. Then, having humiliated the pretender and removed any threat he might pose, Henry gave Lambert a position as a servant in the royal household, working first as a kitchen servant and later as a falconer. From the throne room to the kitchen, quite a dramatic change. Lambert lived out his days as a royal servant, a living reminder of what happened to those who reached too far above their station. But also, in a way, Henry's mercy toward Lambert demonstrated the king's confidence and security. He was so firmly in control that he could afford to be merciful to someone who had challenged him, as these stories show. The path from commoner to ruler was perilous and rarely ended well. Medieval society was rigidly structured, with everyone expected to know and stay in their assigned place. The idea that someone born a peasant could become a king was deeply threatening to the entire social order, which was supposedly ordained by God himself. Kings were kings because God had chosen them and their ancestors to rule. Nobles were nobles for the same reason. And peasants were peasants because that was the role God had assigned them in the great hierarchy of creation. Those who dared upset this supposedly divine order were dealt with harshly, not just to punish them individually, but to send a message to everyone else. Public executions of rebels and pretenders served as powerful warnings. This is what happens when you forget your place. When you try to rise above the station God assigned you. When you challenge those whom heaven has placed above you. The very idea of a peasant ruler was so unthinkable that it could only end in disaster. Even when, as in Lambert's case, the pretender was too young to be truly guilty and was spared execution, he was humiliated and reduced to servitude as a living lesson. The message was clear. The social hierarchy was fixed, natural, and unchangeable. To challenge it was not just politically unwise, but morally wrong. And yet, one must admire the courage of these individuals. These were people who refused to accept their assigned place, who dreamed of something greater than the narrow confines of their birth. Whether motivated by genuine religious visions, as Hans claimed, or by political ambition, as Guillaume demonstrated, or simply caught up in other schemes, as Lambert was, they dared to challenge the most powerful force in their world, the idea that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to obey God in their own way. They challenged the established order, even if only briefly. They demonstrated that the supposedly natural and God-ordained hierarchy was actually maintained by force and threat, not by any true divine will. After all, if the social order were truly natural and part of God's plan, why would it require such brutal suppression of anyone who questioned it? The fact that we still remember these stories centuries later testifies to the enduring appeal of the underdog who dares to reach beyond their station. There is something in human nature that responds to stories of people who refuse to accept their assigned lot, who insist on dreaming larger dreams, even when those dreams are impossible. These medieval peasant kings are remembered not because they succeeded, they all failed. Often tragically, but because they tried. Of course, the reality was far less romantic than our modern sensibilities might wish. For every inspiring tale of someone daring to challenge the status quo, there were countless crushed dreams and brutal suppressions that were never recorded in any chronicle. The medieval world was not kind to those who aimed above their position. Social mobility was nearly non-existent. A peasant's child would almost certainly be a peasant. A merchant's child would likely be a merchant. And a noble's child would inherit nobility. This rigid system was justified through religious teaching and philosophical argument. The church taught that everyone had a role to play in society, and that fulfilling your assigned role well, whatever that role might be, was the path to salvation. A good peasant who worked hard, paid his taxes, obeyed his lord, and attended church faithfully was doing God's will just as much as a king. Indeed, there were religious texts suggesting that the humble peasant who accepted his lot without complaint might be more pleasing to God than the proud noble. But this teaching also served to keep people in their places. If you taught that social inequality was part of God's plan, that questioning your position in life was sinful, then you made it much less likely that people would rebel against the system. The church and the nobility had a mutual interest in maintaining this worldview. The church received support and protection from nobles, while the nobility received religious justification for their privileged position. Still, one cannot help but feel respect for those who dared to try something different, even knowing the likely outcome. They saw injustice and inequality and refused to simply accept it as the natural order. They gathered followers and made their challenge, however brief. They forced those in power to respond with violence and suppression, thereby revealing that power ultimately rested on force, not on any natural or divine mandate. As we approach the end of our long journey through medieval monarchy, it is worth reflecting on what these royal stories tell us about power and human nature. The overarching theme that emerges from all these tales, from the gluttonous feasts to the harsh punishments, from the mental instabilities to the peasant pretenders, is that absolute authority has profound effects on both those who wield it and those who live under it. For the kings themselves, unlimited power seems to have been more curse than blessing. Free from any external restraint, they could indulge every appetite and follow every impulse. And many did exactly that, with results that range from merely unhealthy to actively destructive. The ability to do anything often led to doing everything, to excess in all things, whether food, entertainment, punishment of enemies, or bizarre personal interests. The pressure of being responsible for an entire kingdom, with life and death power over thousands or millions of people, while constantly threatened by rivals and would-be usurpers, was enough to break even strong minds. The cases of Charles and Henry, both suffering mental breakdowns under the weight of kingship, remind us that being a medieval monarch was not the fairy tale of power and privilege that might appear from the outside. For the subjects of these kings, life was shaped entirely by the character and whims of their ruler. A good king meant relative peace, fair taxes, protection from foreign enemies, and justice in the courts. A bad king could mean crushing taxation, arbitrary punishment, constant warfare, and a general atmosphere of fear and oppression. And subjects had essentially no say in who ruled them. They were born under a particular king and would die under whatever king fate provided. The rigidity of the social structure meant that most people had no hope of improving their situation. They would live and die in the same social class into which they were born, doing the same work their parents had done, living in the same village or town. The occasional story of a peasant who briefly claimed royal status was notable, precisely because it was so rare and so remarkable and so doomed to failure. Perhaps there is a lesson for us today in these medieval tales. While modern political leaders may not wield the same godlike power as medieval kings, they are still human beings subject to the same temptations and psychological pressures. The more we concentrate authority in the hands of a few, the greater the risk of that authority being abused. The medieval experience suggests that power should be distributed, checked, and balanced rather than concentrated in any single individual or small group. Medieval kings also offer a cautionary tale about blind obedience to authority. The subjects who unquestioningly followed their sometimes troubled rulers, who carried out harsh orders without question, who accepted the established social hierarchy as natural and unchangeable, enabled the system that often oppressed them. The few who questioned or challenged the system were brutally suppressed, but at least they questioned. They refused to simply accept that might makes right, that those in power deserve to be there simply because they are empowered. So, what can we take away from this long parade of complex medieval monarchs? Perhaps several things. First, a reminder to be vigilant against abuse of power in any form, in any era. Unchecked authority tends toward corruption, whether in medieval kingdoms or modern institutions. Second, that we should not blindly trust in the goodness of our leaders simply because they hold positions of authority. Leaders should be judged by their actions, not by their titles or claims of special status. Third, that we should nurture our own humility and humanity, recognizing that any of us, given absolute power, might succumb to the same temptations that troubled medieval kings. We are all flawed human beings, and the best protection against becoming tyrants ourselves is to recognize our own capacity for tyranny and put systems in place to check it. But on a lighter note, as you prepare for sleep, these historical tales also remind us how fortunate we are to live in our current age. Whatever problems and challenges we face in the modern world, we can be grateful that we are not subject to the absolute whim of a single ruler who might, on a bad day, decide to punish us severely for a minor offense or no offense at all. We may not live the dramatic, operatic lives of medieval kings, with their grand feasts and elaborate tournaments and absolute power over life and death. But we also do not have to face their challenges, the constant threat of assassination or overthrow, the burden of responsibility for entire kingdoms, the isolation that came from being set apart from normal human relationships by the vast gulf of royal status. Most of us will never wear a crown or command armies or make decisions that affect thousands of lives. For that, we should probably be grateful. The lives of medieval monarchs, for all their surface glamour and power, were often troubled, lonely, and ultimately tragic. Many died young, killed in battle or by disease or by rivals. Few seem to have been truly happy, despite having access to every material pleasure their age could provide. At the end of the day, perhaps it is enough to be content in our own lives, whatever our station might be. We may not rule kingdoms, but we also do not bear the terrible weight of kingdoms resting on our shoulders. We may not feast on swan and peacock, but we also do not suffer the health consequences of such excessive indulgence. We may not command absolute obedience from thousands, but we also do not face the isolation and paranoia that such power seem to breed. And so we bid a gentle farewell to the troubled rulers of the Middle Ages. To the Williams and Edwards and Henrys and Charleses and Johns, who wore crowns and shaped history through their decisions and indecisions, their strengths and weaknesses, their sanity and madness. May they rest in whatever peace they have found across the centuries. May their stories continue to fascinate us while also teaching us important lessons about power, humanity, and the dangers of concentrated authority. As you settle into sleep tonight, let these historical tales fade gently into dreams. Let the images of stone castles and royal feasts, of tournaments and tapestries, of kings both wise and troubled, drift through your mind as you relax more deeply. Rest well, knowing that the dramatic excesses of medieval monarchs remain firmly in the past, secured in the pages of history books where they can teach us without harming us. The stories of these medieval rulers, with all their complexity and humanity, remind us of how far society has progressed in creating systems of governance with checks and balances, with rule of law applying even to leaders, with accountability and transparency. We live in an age where leaders can be questioned, where authority must justify itself, where the governed have rights that cannot be arbitrarily taken away. These are precious achievements, hard-won over centuries, paid for in part by those who suffered under medieval tyranny, and in part by those brave souls who dared to question and challenge the system, even knowing the cost. We owe them our gratitude and our vigilance in protecting the freedoms they helped establish. So go forth to peaceful slumber. Dear listener, may your rest be deep and your dreams be pleasant. May you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever the new day brings, secure in the knowledge that we have learned from history's difficult chapters. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well and dream of brighter tomorrows. Grateful for the protections and freedoms we enjoy today that our medieval ancestors could scarcely imagine. Let the gentle rhythm of history's long march lull you to sleep. Let the knowledge that humanity has progressed, has learned, has grown wiser through hard experience, bring you comfort. And let the understanding that you are part of that continuing story, that ongoing human journey toward greater justice and wisdom, bring you peace as you drift off to rest. Sweet dreams, dear listener. Sweet dreams.